Well, welcome back, and we're going to go now and talk a little bit about the gastrointestinal tract and as how it occurs in the body in the medical terms in regards to that. The thing about the gastrointestinal tract, basically, what happens is it's a long tract, as everybody would know, and everything starts at the mouth. Food enters the mouth, and what happens at this point is we start our digestion in the mouth. What happens is the chewing and stuff like that will actually break pieces of food up into smaller particles and creates a ball, which is called a bolus that we keep in our mouth. And at that time, the saliva that's made from a number of glands inside the mouth liquefy it, sort of hold it together like a dough ball. And there's a gland that's in front of the ear that's right here, which is called the parotid gland. And the parotid gland also secretes an enzyme called amylase. This is the first suffix. We talked about this before. If you see a word that ends with a suffix ase, chances are probably pretty good it has something to do with an enzyme. Anyway, the amylase starts to digest starches in the mouth. So we actually start to digest food. We break it up, and the process of chewing is called mastication. And then what happens is we make a ball of this material, okay, with the saliva, and the amylase starts to digest it. Once we do that, then all of a sudden, the ball is pushed to the back of the mouth by the tongue. The roof of the mouth goes up, okay, underneath a stimulus from a nerve in the brain, and it makes the roof of the mouth go up, closes off the nose, and then the food gets pushed to the back of the throat and gets channeled down into the back of the throat and squeezed down and starts to go. At that point, after it gets past the mouth, it goes through this area here called the esophagus. The esophagus goes through the chest. It sits behind in the back side of the chest. And what happens is this esophagus, it's just behind the trachea or the windpipe, like we talked about before. And the esophagus then goes through the diaphragm. When the esophagus goes through the diaphragm, the esophagus then empties into the stomach. Let me see where my little marker, there's my marker. And whoops, empties into the stomach, which is right here. Now, once the food gets in the stomach, there's a sphincter. A sphincter is basically a muscular ring around a tube that will open or close to let things pass through. In other words, like a door. When the food comes down the esophagus, when the food's making its way down the esophagus, it's making its way down the esophagus, the sphincter stays open. Once it gets in the stomach, then that sphincter closes up, keeps the food inside the stomach. Inside the stomach, what happens is there's a number of there's hydrochloric acid, as well as a number of enzymes that sort of mix this stuff up and mix it around a little bit and starts to digest it and break it down to smaller particles. Some things are easy to break down, other things are more hard to break down. Things which have a lot of fiber, like corn, nuts, seeds, strings of pineapple, stuff like that. These things are a lot more cellulose, and the body doesn't break those up nearly as well as other structures. So as a result, what happens is this material will stay inside the stomach for a period of time, okay, until a lot of this stuff, so it stays in here in the stomach for a while, until a lot of this stuff sort of gets broken down a lot more. Now, at the end of the stomach, right about here, X marks the spot, is another little sphincter. And again, a sphincter is a ring of muscle around the tube that prevents food from going one way. And that's called the pyloric sphincter. We'll talk about that in vocabulary. That's also closed while we keep the things inside the stomach. So when the sphincter up at the bottom of the esophagus closes and the sphincter at the pyloric sphincter closes, things are contained inside the stomach. It gets to shake it up a little bit. Eventually, what happens under certain stimuli, the sphincter here at the pylorus area opens up, and then food starts to go into the small intestine. The first portion of the small intestine we'll learn later is called the duodenum. It's really small. It's only maybe about 9 or 10 inches long. It's like a little C. Once we go from the duodenum, it goes to the rest of the intestine. The next part would be the jejunum. It loops around, goes to the ileum. And finally, what happens when it gets to the ileum, it gets right down this area right here. That material, which is still very soupy, it's still slippery, soupy. It smells basically like diarrhea because that's pretty much what it is. All that stuff goes through another sphincter right here, which is called the ileocecal sphincter, and gets inside this area of the large intestine. And this area right down here is called the cecum. There's a little pouch down here. Right at the bottom of the cecum, right here, would be where the appendix is. What happens is then the food then, or the material then goes up the large intestine. That's called the ascending colon. It goes across the transverse colon this way, and then down the descending colon. Now, by that time, what happens in the colon, most of the digestion, once we get in the small intestine, most things are broken down into a small enough pieces that they could be absorbed. In other words, digestion is not enough. I have to be able to absorb it. And the material is then absorbed through the wall of the small intestine. So most of the food that we eat, by the time it gets down to the last part of the small intestine, is in such microscopic or molecular size, it's able to get through the wall of the small intestine, and around the wall of the small intestine, there's blood vessels, and these little fingers that are inside the small intestine, and the blood vessels will then absorb the nutrients that have been previously digested in the stomach and the upper portion of the small intestine, with the assistance of things like the pancreas and the gallbladder and stuff like that, and the liver. So finally, when we get into the large intestine, most of the nutrients that are going to be absorbed have been absorbed. So what does the large intestine do? Well, the other name for the large intestine, okay, the large intestine is called the colon, and that's this whole area right around here. This is getting all be sort of like pretty complicated right now. This is the colon right there. Now, what the colon primarily does is it takes most of the water out of whatever is left inside the intestine. Therefore, it takes very liquid fecal material like a diarrhea and makes it into much more formed stools. Eventually, what happens is the material gets down to this area down in here. This area down here, this is where it makes a little curve, is called the sigmoid colon. And when it gets down here, that's called the rectum. The purpose of the rectum is to be able to store fecal material until we're ready to go ahead and deposit it wherever we need to deposit it. Okay, and then then the fecal material is expelled out through the area of the anus. So basically, what we've talked about going from the mouth and into the stomach, and then also into some of the small intestine, is what we call digestion. Digestion means we're breaking down materials to small enough molecular particles so they can be absorbed, which gets me to the second word. My second word is absorption. Once I have those small enough particles, then that material is absorbed through the wall of the small intestine, okay, and gets into the blood. The blood's eventually going to take it up to this big chunky thing right here, which is called the liver, and the liver then distributes it to the rest of the body where it needs to go, and then also back to the heart. But most of those materials that are going to be absorbed are absorbed in the bottom portion of the small intestine. Finally, what happens is then whatever's not being used gets into the large intestine, goes up the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, down the descending colon, through the sigmoid colon, and into the rectum. At that point, we're ready for elimination, as getting rid of the material that's not being used, the waste material that's not going to be used at all. And basically, that's what the GI tract does. Now, it has a lot of other things. We have what I call the primary organs. The primary areas would be the esophagus and the stomach and the small intestine, the large intestine, and stuff like that. But we also have accessory organs that are important. The liver helps in digestion and absorption in the GI tract. The pancreas does, the gallbladder, and I'll be talking about those when we get to those words in our vocabulary terms in a little bit. But basically, that's the beginning. Let's talk about where we start, and that's talking about the combining forms. Ano. Ano is a combining form that obviously means anus. Anus is the end of the run. It's to be able to eliminate at the end of the anus, there's also a sphincter, a ring of muscle, and that ring of muscle keeps the fecal material inside the rectum until it's ready to be eliminated. And that's called that's the word root ano means anus. Appendo or appendicle both mean appendix. There we go. Appendix. What is the appendix for? And the good point is, close your eyes. What do you see? Nothing. It doesn't really do anything. Maybe at some point it had some purpose, but really doesn't do anything. It's basically a hollow tube, a very small worm-shaped hollow tube that sits down there. The bad part about the appendix is things that don't get digested very well and finally get into the area, that cecum, that first portion of the large intestine. Things that don't get digested very well, like seeds, husks, things like that, get jammed down inside that appendix sometimes, and then the bacteria go crazy. They have like a smorgasbord down there, and as a result they start to proliferate, and that's when people get an acute appendicitis, where the appendix becomes involved with all kinds of pus. Has to come out, because if the appendix gets big, fills with pus, and it bursts, all this pus now then is free to travel around the whole abdomen, which then causes all kinds of problems, which they don't want to happen. So anyway, that's all about the appendix. Buccal. Buccal is a word root that means cheek, The inside of the cheek is called the buccal mucosa. Mucosa is the lining, the slippery lining, and it's inside the cheek, so it's called buccal. Now, the muscle here that works my cheeks a little bit is called the buccinator. So buccal means cheek, okay? Ceco means cecum. Now that cecum, like I mentioned, is that first portion of the large intestine. Where the small intestine has the material that it has and deposits in the large intestine, it goes into a little tiny a pouchy area at the first portion of the large intestine, and that area is called the cecum. It's called the cecum. And at the bottom of the cecum is right where we find our appendix. Okay. Celio means abdomen or belly. Okay. When the aorta, we talked about the aorta, gets down through the diaphragm, the first big branch that it gives off is called the celiac trunk, because now this celiac trunk comes out like a hydra with all kinds of branches. It goes to the liver, it goes to some of the stomach, it goes to the first portion of the duodenum, it goes to the gallbladder, it goes to the pancreas, it goes multiple places in the belly. So celio actually means abdomen or belly. When people have celiac disease, and if you don't know what celiac disease, it used to be called sprue. The old name for celiac disease is sprue. And those are the people who are intolerant to gluten. They have to go on a gluten-free diet. Basically, what it does is gluten, people who can't handle gluten, which is gluten is a byproduct or is part of what we call wheat. Okay, wheat has the gluten in them, and if people can't handle the gluten, they have all kinds of abdominal problems because they can't digest things that have wheat in them, and it creates all kinds of problems. So that's what celio. Celio means abdomen or belly. Chylo means lip. Means lip. Okay, there are a couple. Labio means lip. Chylo means lip. So we'll get to that a little bit later. Cholecysto or choleo both mean gallbladder. Chole means bile or bladder or gall. Cysto is a word root that also means bladder. So if I say gall, chole, cyst, get gallbladder. Okay. Sometimes just choleo will be enough, but cholecysto or choleo both mean gallbladder. Choledocho is a little bit different. Obviously, chole, and I'm in the way here. Can't, you'll have to trust me on this. Choledocho, what happens is the gallbladder sits underneath the liver. Okay, if you look at a picture of the abdomen, you'll see this greenish sac that sits underneath the liver. What the gallbladder does is it contains something called bile. Now there's a long way that this bile is produced, and I'll get a chance to talk about it when we do some vocabulary words. But what bile does is it helps to break down fats. It helps to liquefy or emulsify fats. Well, from that gallbladder, I need to have a duct, okay, that actually will allow the gallbladder to squeeze this bile, which is like a brownish, bittery. If you ever vomited, you get this brownish, bittery tasting stuff that's sort of thick and mushy. That's bile. That's coming from the air of the gallbladder. But it takes the gallbladder and squeezes the gallbladder into the first portion of the small intestine called the duodenum, and it's going through what's called the common bile duct. So choledocho means common bile duct, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on as to how that's formed and stuff like that, and what the importance is, and how bile is actually formed. That's sort of an interesting subject about how bile is formed. And I'll talk about that later. So anyway, these are the first portion of our combining forms. Col or colonal obviously means colon or large intestine. So if you hear the word colon, it means large intestine. So colo or colano both mean large intestine. Denti, doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. Tooth, dental, tooth. Duodeno. Duodeno means the duodenum. The duodenum, again, is that first portion of the small intestine. It's right after that material comes out of the stomach, and that's called the duodenum. Again, it's really short. It's only about 9 inches, and it's like a little C-shaped area in my right side, upper side of my abdomen, and that's the duodenum. Okay, the duodenum, lots of stuff goes on in the duodenum. It's small but mighty. A lot of really very intensive digestion also occurs in the duodenum, and that gallbladder with that duct drains into the duodenum to help to emulsify fats. Okay, entero means intestine or small intestine. So enteritis would be inflammation or infection of the small intestine. Okay, esophago obviously means esophagus. And esophagus, we know, is that food pipe that goes from the mouth down through the diaphragm and into the stomach. So esophago means esophagus. That's an easy one. Okay, facio means face. She doesn't take a rocket science to figure that one out either. So facio means face. Gastro means stomach. That was one we had probably at the very beginning of the year. We talked about, when we were starting to learn how to put together words. Gastro means stomach. Gingivo means gums. When people have gingivitis, it's an inflammation of the gum tissue. Okay, so people when they floss and stuff like that, they go to the dentist, they check down these little pockets, see how deep these pockets are, to see if they have gingival disease. Okay, uh, so that's gingival means gums. Glosso means tongue. Means tongue. Okay. Sometimes people with certain vitamin deficiencies, what'll happen is their tongue gets like a beefy red, and you can't see the taste buds on there. It gets really shiny and smooth, and that's called glossitis. Certain things like B12 and other types of vitamins will actually cause that tongue to change in appearance. Okay, so glosso means tongue. Kids with Down syndrome, one of the things that they frequently see, if you know someone with Down syndrome, is they have a very large tongue. The tongue fills a lot more of the oral cavity than other people without Down syndrome. And this is called a macroglossia. Macroglossia, okay? Okay, because macro means large, okay? So that's some of the other combining forms, a few more. Hepato. Hepato means liver, okay? And we had that one before. Hepatitis would be an inflammation of the liver. Ilio. Ilio means ileum. Now, the ileum that we're talking about here, and this is with an E, not an I, ileum is the last portion of the small intestine. The small intestine goes from a very small duodenum to a quite large, quite long jejunum, and to an equally long, if maybe slightly longer, goes from the duodenum, 9 inches or so, to a jejunum, which is long, and to an ileum, which is a little bit longer, or at least equal in length to the jejunum. Okay, so ileum is the third portion of the small intestine, where jejunum is the second portion of the small intestine. Duodenum, jejunum, ileum. We talked about this one before, mentioned this one before. Labio means lip, means lip. So that's labio. Okay, anywhere you have something with a lip on it, it's called labio. Okay, laparo. Laparo also means abdomen. Sometimes when they do surgery in the abdomen, they just go through that tube. It's called laparoscopic. Scopy means view with a tube or an instrument, and where they are viewing the abdomen. So it's called laparoscopy or laparoscopic surgery. Okay, linguo. Linguo is also another word that means tongue. Glosso and linguo both mean tongue. When some people take certain medications, they stick it under the tongue. When people take nitroglycerin, if they're having chest pain, they stick it under the tongue, and that's called sublingual. AL pertaining to sub, below, lingual, the tongue. Okay, so lingual also means tongue. Mandibulo means mandible, and that's the lower jawbone. That should be an easy one because we had that in the skeletal portion. Odonto. Odonto means tooth. Easy. So that's easy. Oro means mouth. That shouldn't take a whole lot to figure that one out, which that one will never show up on an exam. But oral means mouth. Okay. A few more combining forms we have here. Palato. Palato means palate. Okay, and the palate's the roof of the mouth. It's the roof of the mouth. If you feel with your finger inside, the front portion is hard. Guess what they call that? The hard palate. If you feel back towards that little thing that hangs down the back, which is called the uvula, if you feel back there, guess what they call that one? The soft palate. Guess why? It's soft. Okay, so that's called the palate. That's the roof of the mouth. Pancreato means pancreas, obviously. The pancreas is a really interesting organ. It's actually stuck to the backside of the abdominal wall behind the stomach. The pancreas is important because what happens is it's a place where we make a hormone called insulin. It helps me to get glucose inside the cell. Also makes another hormone called glucagon, which actually increases my blood sugar. Where insulin decreases my blood sugar, glucagon increases my blood sugar. But in the digestive system, it also is a source of a number of different enzymes that squirt into the duodenum along with that bile duct, that common bile duct from the gallbladder, squirts into the duodenum to help in digesting food in the duodenum. So the pancreas does have both enzymes that it produces to help to digest, as well as hormones such as insulin, which helps to get the glucose, once it's been absorbed, into the cell. Okay, Peritoneo means peritoneum. Now we had this before because that peritoneum was that membrane that covers the inside of the abdomen. The part of that membrane that covers the inside wall of the abdomen is called the parietal peritoneum. We know that from before. And when it gets to the backside of the abdomen, it folds back and covers all the abdominal organs itself, and that's called the visceral peritoneum because it covers the organs. Okay, so that's peritoneum. Pharyngeal means throat. Pharynx, you know. I have a pharyngitis, I have a sore throat. Okay. Procto means anus and rectum. You know, it means anus and rectum. It's a word root that means anus and rectum. Pyloro. Pyloro stands for that pyloric sphincter, okay, or the area, the end of the stomach. The stomach is like a little, like a bag, okay? It's a sack. It's filled with all the digestive enzymes after I eat. You know, there's a little bit there all the time, a little bit of mucus in there, and the mucus covers and lines the inside of the stomach to prevent the acid from burning through the wall of the stomach. So we all have mucus inside of our stomach. What happens is, again, when the food gets into this, goes from the esophagus in the stomach, that sphincter at the bottom of the esophagus and the top of the stomach will close to keep things so they don't come up. The problem is when people have what's called GERD, and we'll talk about that in a couple lectures down the road. GERD, actually what happens is the sphincter doesn't close and the acid comes up into the esophagus and burns the esophagus, which results in that quote heartburn, okay? And then we have at the other end of the stomach, before it gets into the duodenum, that other sphincter, which is called this pyloric sphincter. And that pyloric sphincter, if that pyloric sphincter and the lower esophageal sphincter close off, everything stays in the stomach. To get stuff from the stomach into the small intestine, the duodenum, that pyloric sphincter has to open. Okay. Sometimes babies, when they're born, that pyloric sphincter is really tight and it's not open enough. So when they're born, they start to feed, and they're feeding and feeding and feeding, and nothing's getting out of the stomach. And as a result, the stomach gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And what happens is the pressure in the stomach gets so big that, and it's not leaving the stomach because that sphincter can't open, that pyloric sphincter can't open enough. As a result, what happens is they get what's called projectile vomiting. And if you've ever seen a baby or a kid with a projectile vomiting, it's an amazing sight. You go to YouTube and type in projectile vomiting, and it'll destroy all your dinner, I'm sure, because what happens comes out with such force. Because again, the pressure builds up in the stomach because the pyloric sphincter doesn't open. Okay, so that's just another little tidbit of fun facts that you can share with your friends and neighbors. Okay. Recto means rectum, and again, that rectum is the place where we store fecal material until it's ready to be eliminated. Sial-adeno is actually a combination of two word roots. S-I-A-L means saliva, adeno means gland. So sial means saliva, adeno means gland. So sial-adeno means salivary gland. Okay. Sigmoido means sigmoid colon. Now I mentioned before that what happens is the descending colon, we have our ascending colon that goes up, transverse colon that goes across, the descending colon goes down. But the problem is, hey, guess what, folks? The anus and rectum is over here. So I have to get things over. So it goes through this S-shaped curve like this, and this little S-shaped curve right there is called the sigmoid colon, okay, where it goes to that little S-shaped curve, because it looks like the Greek letter sigma. And that Greek letter sigma looks like something like that, okay? Looks like that. So that's that. Spleno obviously means spleen. Now there's a really unusual way that the spleen is involved in the GI system. What happens is red blood cells only last so long. They last about 100, 120 days. And at that time they get really old and they get put out to pasture, and that pasture is the spleen. The spleen gobbles up all those old red blood cells and starts to break them down. It takes the iron from the red blood cells, puts it back in the circulation so they can reuse the iron. But it takes all the protein from the red blood cell and sends it over to the liver. And what the liver does, it takes that protein that's made from the broken down red blood cells and sent to the liver and makes it into our good old friend called bilirubin. Bilirubin is a yellowish brown pigment. What happens is if that bilirubin builds up in the blood or I can't eliminate it, that's what causes what we call jaundice, when the skin starts to turn yellow, because the blood starts to fill more with this yellowish brownish pigment, leaches out into the skin and turns the skin, the whites of the eyes, and roof of the mouth, and like that yellow, and that's called jaundice. So anyway, the parts of the red blood cells spent over to the liver makes them into this bilirubin, and then the liver then further makes the bilirubin into what's called bile by adding cholesterol and other stuff, and then bile then is transported into the gallbladder and stored in the gallbladder, and when we eat a fatty meal, the gallbladder squeezes out like a tube of toothpaste into the duodenum to help to digest fats. Okay, so spleno means spleen, So that's how the spleen. Oh, interesting thing too is once that bile gets into the small intestine to help to break down fats, it starts to travel with the food, with the material. I can't say food anymore because it's not. I sure wouldn't eat that stuff. What happens is it travels down the small intestine. What happens is bacteria. Some of that bile is broken down and reused, put back in the system so they can reuse it. But some of it stays with the material as it goes down the GI tract. here's what happens. Certain bacteria act upon it, and they become fixed into the material, and that's what, listen really close now, that's what turns bowel movements brown. It's the old bile. People who have a gallbladder disease where they can't get the bile out to help to digest fats, like after a fatty meal they get this pain in the belly because they can't digest the fats very well because the bile's not coming out of the gallbladder like it should. What happens is their stools actually turn very clay colored, almost tan. They lose the color simply because they're not putting any bile into the GI tract, which eventually is what the breakdown product of that is actually what causes bowel movements to be brown. Okay, stomato. Stomato means mouth. Means mouth. Sometimes also people with vitamin deficiencies, they get a stomatitis. You'll see they get these scabs and scarring at the or cracks at the corners of the mouth, and it's called stomatitis from some nutritional problems and stuff like that. Uvulo. Uvulo means uvula. Now that's that little thing that hangs from the back of the throat, that hangs down, that little punching bag thing. I bet you if you looked at all your friends and family and neighbors and say, hey, you mind if I take a quick peek at your uvula? What happens is you'd be all kinds of different ones. There'll be big ones, small ones, some that actually split into like two pieces that come apart that way, all kinds of things. Basically, the soft palate has muscles in it that rise up to seal off the back of the nose, the mouth from the back of the nose, so food doesn't come out the nose. And that uvula is where these muscles come together. So if you had a uvula that's a small uvula, it means nothing. It doesn't make a difference one way or the other. If it was ever cut off, it doesn't make a difference one way. Not saying that you should go cut your uvula off or anything like that, but it doesn't make one difference one way or the other. But just where the muscles come together, there's a small muscle in there, which is at the end of the soft palate muscles. So let's talk about a couple other combining forms. Hernio. Hernio means hernia. Means hernia. Okay. And what a hernia is, my thing's all locked up here. There we go. Here, hernia. Hernia means hernia. Hernia is a weakness in the abdominal wall. And what happens is, if you have a weakness in the abdominal wall, when you cough, sneeze, strain, stuff like that, your intestinal contents actually come out through that gap in the muscle wall, and they're sitting underneath the skin. Obviously, you don't not walking around and have to poke your intestines back in, but it sits underneath the skin, okay? And it causes a bulge or a large lump area. What happens, it usually goes back. Sometimes when it doesn't go back, when it gets caught outside, that's what we call incarcerated or strangulated hernia, but that doesn't happen all that often. Basically, all they do is they do what's called a herniorrhaphy. Rhaphy means to suture. They go in, open up the abdomen, find where that weakness is, close it with some suture, which is sewing it closed, or put a mesh in there, and it's done. Lipo. Lipo means fat. So an enzyme that would be involving that would digest fat would be called lipase. Lipase, L-I-P-A-S-E. So lipo means fat. Litho means stone. We had that one before in our long words. How about cholelithiasis? Cholelithiasis. Chole means gallbladder. Litho means stone. So cholelithiasis would be the medical term for a gallstone. Gallstone. So litho means stone. A couple combining forms for substances. Amylo. Amylo means amylase, which is a starch. Okay, so amylo means starch. Bili means gall or bile. Bili means gall or bile. Okay. Bilirubin means bilirubin, and bilirubin is that stuff, that brownish pigment. Sometimes babies after they're born, they get a jaundice, and what happens is their liver's not good enough to be able to handle the bilirubin. The bilirubin builds up and it gets out in the skin. It's usually not much of a problem. Okay, stick them under some lights and ultraviolet lights, and it doesn't stop the process, but it sort of like takes it out of the skin. The reason why it happens after birth is the liver's not quite fully developed. It can't do what it needs to do, and it can't handle that. So that's what happens with that. Again, chole we talked about before means gall or bile, so that's pretty simple. Okay, chlorhydro means hydrochloric acid. And that's like in the stomach. Again, that stomach has a lot of hydrochloric acid that helps to digest things. The reason why it doesn't burn through the wall of my stomach is because my stomach is lined with all kinds of mucus. I'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about GERD. Okay, gluco means sugar. Guess what glyco means? Glyco also means sugar. Glycogeno is different. Glycogeno is glycogen or animal starch. Well, what is that? The body can't store glucose. It really can't. But it could do it in a different way. In other words, it can't store glucose. Glucose wants to get inside the cell because to get inside the cell for energy. And what happens is when we eat a meal, the pancreas secretes insulin. Insulin goes to the cells, binds to little receptors in the surface of cells that open up the doors to let the glucose get in. Okay, but I can't store the glucose. But the body says, there must be a way around that. Let's rework that. And what it does, it takes the glucose molecules and links them together in a long chain. And it creates this new form. This new form of glucose that's linked in a long chain is called glycogen. So we take that glycogen, which now can be stored in like the skeletal muscle as well as in the liver. So if I have a rainy day where I need a little bit of glucose and I'm running out, guess what happens? Because glucose is a very short supply in the circulation going around, I can actually go to my liver or my skeletal muscle, take out the glycogen and break it up, cut it like in pieces like slices of bread, and now I have glucose to be able to use. Lipo, we mentioned before, lipo means fat. We had that before. Litho, we talked about, means stone. Proteo, guess what? That means protein. So an enzyme that would actually get rid of or break down protein would be called protease. Sialo, we talked about, is saliva or salivary. Steato. Steato means fat. Again, oops, I should have gone ahead. Okay, I can't go back. One of the things about steato is if the gallbladder is not putting out the bile to help to break down fat, fat stays in the material in the small intestines and eventually in the colon. And as a result, the stools are very fatty. They have very fatty stools. Well, you say, how do I know if the stools are fat? Simple. Fatty stools are lighter than water, so fatty stools float. So if you have floaty bowel movements, you have more fat in your stool than you probably should. And also, fatty stools have a tendency to be a little bit more bubbly. Just another fun fact for dinner time talk. Okay, but fatty stools occur with gallbladder disease because the gallbladder is not squeezing out the bile, either because the duct is swollen shut or there's a stone blocking the duct or something like that, and therefore I can't break down fats. Fat stays with the material, eventually ends up staying in the fecal material, and the stools are fat, and that's called steatorrhea. Steatorrhea. Okay, but steato means fat. Okay, couple suffixes. Ectasis or ectasia means dilation or stretching. That's an old one. We talked about that much earlier in the year. Okay, emesis. Emesis means vomiting. Means vomiting. Guess what hematemesis would be? Obviously, blood in the vomit. So emesis means vomiting. If you ever worked in a hospital setting, what happens? They have these little kidney bean shaped pans. They're called emesis basins that never catch anything. It's usually when someone pukes, it's all over the place and it never catches the pan. There's like 3 drops of the pan, everything else all over everybody else. But anyway, emesis means vomiting. Okay, lysis means breakdown. That's an old one we had before, breakdown or destruction. Okay, pepsia. Pepsia means digestion. So therefore, you can easily determine what's bad digestion. Dyspepsia, because we know dys means bad, difficult, or painful. So pepsia means digestion. Phagia means eating. Polyphagia. People with diabetes have polyphagia, which means that they have a tendency to want to eat a lot. Okay, so phagia means eating. Plasty means a surgical repair. That's an old one. Gastroplasty, or whatever the case may be, repairing the stomach. So plasty means a surgical repair. Ptosis means a droop or sag. I'm not sure why I even put that in there. Ptysis means spitting. That's an old one. We had that in the respiratory section. So ptysis means spitting. Okay. And rage or ragia means bursting forth with blood. Okay. So basically that's what that all means. Couple other suffixes. Raphy. Raphy means suture, like a herniorrhaphy would be suturing a hernia or a weakness in the abdominal wall. Rhea means a flow or discharge, like diarrhea is a flow or discharge of fecal material. Okay, so rhea means a flow or discharge. Spasm means a sudden involuntary contraction, gastric spasm or something like that. Stasis means stopping or controlling. Okay, that one's an old one we had before. Stenosis means narrowing, another old one that we had before. All these were old. Tresia. Tresia means opening, Sometimes what happens, there's something called a biliary atresia, where the ducts don't open in the liver. Okay, and as a result, that could be a problem. So tresia means opening. Atresia means a without an opening. Ace, again, as I mentioned, if you see a word that ends in ace, most likely it means an enzyme. Chesia means defecation or waste elimination. If someone has bloody bowel movements, it's called hematochesia. Hematochesia would be bloody bowel movements. Prandial. Prandial means meals. Something that you take after meals would be called postprandial. Postprandial, after meals.